Hey there, welcome to another episode of the BlockCrunch podcast, the podcast where we share condensed insights from builders, entrepreneurs, and investors in the world of crypto. I'm your host, Jason Choi, and this episode is slightly different from all the other episodes that we've done so far because instead of discussing token mechanics or scalability or challenges faced by ICO projects or investment frameworks, we're going to be talking about something pretty out there in my opinion. And I'm talking about Cellarius, a company funded by ConsenSys to do one thing, which is to put a sci-fi narrative on the blockchain. The idea itself sounds pretty exciting and quite different from most of the projects that I've heard of, and might just represent a new way in which narratives could be created and stories could be told in a transmedia and collaborative manner across the world. So here to tell us more about how blockchain could change storytelling is a man who probably has the coolest job title that I've ever heard of, Chief Universe Architect of Cellarius, Anthony Apollo. So without further ado, let's buckle up and dive right in.
This is this worldwide phenomenon.
This week, we do have a huge idea, which is putting sci-fi on the blockchain. And I'm talking about Cellarius, which is this transmedia project that leverages blockchain technology to empower fans to repurpose, remix, and create original content that feed into one ongoing science fiction narrative about a cyberpunk future. Cellarius is a ConsenSys spoke, meaning they're supported by one of the biggest Ethereum development companies, and anyone anywhere with an internet connection will be able to access and contribute to the Cellarius lore and be recognized for the work. And here to tell us more about Cellarius is the universe architect, Anthony Apollo. So welcome to the show, Anthony.
Thank you for having me, Jason.
So just to start us off, can you tell us what is Cellarius and what does universe architect actually mean? Because it sounds like an awesome role.
Absolutely. So at Cellarius, we like to say that we are reinventing collective storytelling for a modern, decentralized, and equitable world. In a bit more detail, I could give you the pitch that I think you touched on a little bit in the intro. We like to say that the Cellarius universe is an original transmedia cyberpunk franchise that utilizes blockchain technology and user-generated assets to create a collaborative, fan-curated story. So we've received some feedback that our elevator pitch only works if you're going to the 99th floor, which we do agree with. But you had me for 20 minutes, so I can happily break that down a little bit. So in terms of originality, we've built the framework for the Cellarius universe from the ground up. We're not leveraging any existing franchise. And if there's one central thematic question that our lore focuses on, is humanity prepared for the consequences of our insatiable desire to push the limits of technology, specifically around AI in our world? In terms of transmedia, we want Cellarius to be as inclusive to different media types as possible. So we're starting off with more traditional content like illustrations, written stories, music, but hope to expand to things like cosplay or recipes or games over time. So we really want it all. In terms of cyberpunk, so cyberpunk is a sci-fi niche, but while a lot of science fiction stories focus on these heavily dystopic universes, like the Terminator example, where there's just robots subjugating humanity, we take a very different angle, right? We focus on this artificial intelligence, which is named Cellarius, whose motives are really unknown. Over time, it's both beneficial and destructive towards humanity. So there's a bit of a question there about, what is this thing? What is this entity? And then I would note that we have a whole post about our own cyberpunk carve-out called Blockpunk, which you can read on our Medium. In terms of blockchain, really, we embrace ethos of sharing and openness, community empowerment, but I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit more in a few minutes. In terms of user-generated content, we really want to work with our community to grow a global and inclusive set of collaborators with the goal that really, in time, we can hand off the stewardship of the project to the community writ large, that we won't be necessarily a centralized party governing this. So a bit of a mouthful, but that is Cellarius. Yep, go ahead.
I guess as a universe architect, is your role to kind of shape the way the narrative works then? Or are you kind of helping these creators that you mentioned create this universe together?
Right, so perhaps originally shepherding the story along was a bit of my role. So I think that the title universe architect, I think, may have just been used originally because we had to put something in the employment paperwork for ConsenSys. But over time, it's kind of stuck. So I was one of the first people to join the Cellarius project full time. And when I came on board, ostensibly, my remit was to flesh out the story. But the goal here has always been to create a story framework, more so than like a robust, detailed 400-page novel that someone can read and say, okay, this is the story, I'm done now. We had to create this structure and scaffolding that had enough openness in it so that people could take a look at it, digest it, and then figure out which points they wanted to build on top of. So when I first started, it was a bit of building out what is now our universe guide, which you can download on our website, and as well as actually contracting authors and artists to help build out some of that imagery and some of that world. I think, I started at ConsenSys and on Cellarius specifically in September of last year. I think maybe not even a month into that tenure was New York Comic Con. So I spent 4 days promoting what was then a very nebulous project to folks and authors and artists who are on these panels and reaching out to all of them to see if anyone was interested in working with us. And, that's how we kind of got a large swath of the original content that we essentially commissioned for this project.
Got it. That's exciting. And that actually feeds into my next question as well, is as a universe architect, what type of background do you need? Can you talk a little bit about your experience and what type of skills do you need to be a universe architect at a project like Cellarius?
Sure. So professionally, I actually started my career in audit at one of the big four firms. Then I went from that to consulting. So, it's more of the same at another big four firm. And then went from there and did a consulting gig at DocuSign, which is actually great. But so from that, I had sort of this holistic project management skill set that I could leverage. But being having to have a obligatory millennial side hustle, my brother and I, in that same kind of time period, were working on a brewery project. It was called the Masked Menace Brewery. You can actually still check out the website; it's still live. And we were in love with brewing, and it was kind of becoming a crowded space. So we were trying to think of how we can carve out our own niche for ourselves. And what we came up with was this idea of creating our own story about these characters in like this kind of fourth wall breaking brewery. So myself, my brother, a couple other friends that we brewed with, we were the villains of this universe. There were different supernatural characters that would represent all of the four ingredients of beer, so hops, water, yeast, and grain. And then the heroes of this world were parodies of the macro breweries. So, and then every beer that we made, based on the ingredients that were in it, essentially depicted some sort of interaction between parties of those characters. So we kind of created this whole world around it. We created the stories, created the copy. We were commissioning art. I think that fed a lot into the skill set at Cellarius. And even further than that, when we dropped the brewery project because it was such a crowded space, and there wasn't necessarily opportunities for what's called contract brewing, we had kind of pivoted, and my brother Frank and I started working on a graphic novel. And what we wanted to do with that one that was a bit different was create one that would have musical accompaniment with it, which a couple of other projects have done, but not a whole ton. So we started to build that out, and we were just about to get that on Kickstarter when the opportunity to join the Cellarius team came forward. So I had been interested in blockchain for a couple of years and certainly jumped at that. But to go back to the question, is this kind of combined skill set of project management and also the creative aspects as well. Everything from starting up an LLC and doing finances to coming up with characters and copy and storylines. Certainly multifaceted in that capacity.
And this feeds well into the point about transmedia narratives. And in the past, I think, especially 5 to 10 years, we really see the way that stories are being told really evolve. So instead of just having stories being told by one author or one director in a movie or in a book, we're seeing these stories kind of being fleshed out in transmedia formats, kind of like what you just talked about as well. And what's interesting is the internet has allowed fans all around the world for different stories to create their own versions of the stories or to flesh out these narratives further on things like, for instance, Wikia, which allow you to create pages around a certain lore, and you have YouTube where people are creating kind of their fan movies that are spin-offs of existing franchises like Star Wars or, like you said, Terminator. So I'm curious as to what is Cellarius changing on top of this kind of burgeoning infrastructure of what fans have been able to use before. Specifically, why are you using a blockchain, and how does it help the narrative?
Sure. So I think we need to take that in two directions. And one would be to address intellectual property, or IP, first. So the examples you're giving on Wikia and YouTube, it's unlikely that the creators of those products, especially like YouTube videos or things that are put on Kickstarter, are able to monetize their contributions in any meaningful way, because the companies and these centralized organizations that own that intellectual property are essentially forced by law to protect it. Otherwise, they risk losing their claim to that property. So a lot of times these fan projects can't actually monetize things. If they start to, they get shut down pretty quickly. Things like Wikia, I mean, those are simply pages that describe content that already exists. And if I was, one of these centralized organizations and fans were going to do some of the work for me, I would certainly allow that. One of the examples I frequently turn to is a website called Archive of Our Own, or AO3. It's a fan fiction writing site with like 4 million posts on it, essentially written stories that are across tons of different franchises, everything from like Buffy the Vampire Slayer to Harry Potter to Metal Gear Solid. So I turn to that one, and there's some great content on there, but it's not like any of that could really be monetized lest the creator risk legal penalties. So what we're doing is we are trying to create this umbrella IP for Cellarius, and then we'll have all of the creators essentially under that IP so that we can protect their contributions, so they can essentially own their contributions within the universe. We talk about it in our white paper as permissive licensing, somewhere that lives between the current, more familiar IP structure and open source. And, that's going to take some time to build out. There's certainly a lot of legal considerations around that and how we can make that work across various media types. But it's something that we firmly believe that we have to work on that. And, the number one goal for us is to make sure that our creators who are contributing to Cellarius can be protected. And I think that maybe funnels well into your next question about why blockchain. So there's a couple of reasons we want to use a blockchain for story content, which I'll get to in a second. But really for the protection of our creators, we want it to be such that whoever creates a piece of content and uploads it to the Cellarius platform, it'll be tagged as such with their name, the names of any contributors, any other sort of tags that we choose to add in there, and make it such so you have kind of provenance and asset management as you go down this pipeline. So to give you maybe an example would be the best case here. So let's say Anthony creates a really captivating story, a written story, and then Jason reads that story, and Jason is an illustrator, and you want to illustrate one of the protagonists from what I've written. You'll be well within your rights to do that, provided that, the attribution of that character, the original character's creation, references Anthony. And then if someone creates a derivative of Jason's work, again, you'll have that whole pipeline of creators and contributors behind it. So that's one aspect of it. And going towards the more story-related elements, community-related elements of why blockchain. So in terms of the story, one of the things we talk about a lot is immutability of the lore. The example we always point to as what we want to avoid is when Disney purchased Star Wars, right? So when that acquisition happened, Disney essentially condensed this whole universe and scrapped so much of it and said, okay, we have the movies and that's essentially it. And throughout what's referred to as the extended universe, which was 35 years of fan creations, licensed books, licensed graphic novels and comics, licensed video games, all of that got tossed. And that was considered canon. It was considered part of the lore. And essentially they're just starting again with the more recent films and projects. So what we're working on is essentially a system for community-driven canonization. This is where the fan curation comes in as well, where if Anthony posts a story, the community has to vote on whether that story becomes part of the lore that will exist unto perpetuity. And we expect that there's going to be some headbutting over what stories become part of the story, part of the unending lore or not. But we wanted to kind of leave those considerations up to the community. The only thing we as an organization building this out will canonize is a text version of the universe guide. So any images, any stories, even the stuff that we've commissioned, that's not going to be grandfathered in any way. We're simply saying, here's what we've created so far. It'll be treated as any other contributions that come in down the road. And it'll have to be fan votes dictating what is or is not part of the central Cellarius lore.
So I'd like to step in the shoes of a content creator, a writer or filmmaker or painter for a moment, just so we can better understand what is the value proposition that Cellarius is offering to creators. So if I'm a creator, if I'm a writer, if I want to make a film or I want to write a story or want to paint a picture based on characters from, say, the Star Wars universe, there's always the risk that Disney can come in and acquire the parent company behind the Star Wars franchise, LucasArts, and say, okay, all of this fan art, all of the effort that fans have put into the past 35 years are no longer canon. Whereas if I contribute to a project like Cellarius, every development in the story is publicly trackable and is basically decided upon by the community, and the entire story is driven by the community, and it's totally transparent, and the IP is totally transparent on the blockchain. Would you say that is the central proposition of Cellarius?
Yeah, that's absolutely part of it. And again, I think that speaks to us as a group who's kicking this off, wanting to progressively decentralize over time. We certainly don't want to be running this, forever and ever. I think that would be kind of a failure on our half. I've been asked what is my personal goal for this project over, several, over the years, let's just call it. And I've said, well, I want to not matter. And I was asked to provide a less morbid version of that response, which was, I want to be able to choose to opt out if I ever wanted to, which means at the end of the day that, I shouldn't have any sway over what the community thinks or does or how they act. Really, over time, we want this to be a truly decentralized project. We can't get there overnight, right? We need to stand up the infrastructure for it. We need to actually have some story content there. In the early days when we were asking the folks that we were commissioning to create art or story content, didn't really have anything even like the universe guide ready yet. The questions did come back to us like, this is cool, but I still need a little bit of guidance. So we do have to do a bit of shepherding up front, but over time, we really want to create incentive structures and task folks within the community to help us, run this and then give the power to them.
Mm-hmm. So let's touch on that a little bit more. So say I am a creator and I want to be a part of the Cellarius universe. So where do I first find out more about Cellarius, and what type of content can I create specifically? And what is the process for submitting my work, and how is this selected to be part of this, this immutable lore?
Sure. So a couple of things there. So you can find out more about us at cellarius.network. That's CELLARIUS.network. On that page, we have our universe guide, which again provides the framework of this universe. We have a white paper that describes kind of what we want to do, our motives for getting this off the ground, and how we look to proceed with our alpha experience. There's also community guidelines and a style guide about how some of the aesthetic influences came around for this world that we're building. In terms of the current way to kind of get content out there, so we have a couple of devs and are scaling up currently who are building out our private alpha platform. So we're hoping that that'll be ready within the next couple of months and be able to onboard folks there. But if you want to take part in that alpha, we ask that you head to Cellarius.network and apply. There's a short application for that alpha. And we're looking for everybody, right? Certainly creators, but also those who just want to play around a bit in this world and have fun. So We ask if you're a creator that you provide us with, through that application, that you provide us with a portfolio that we can take a look at. And if you are not a creator, that's totally cool. We're looking for people from all walks of life, everyone from crypto enthusiasts to science fiction readers to gamers to even kind of this interesting concept where we want to have like scientists and researchers or people who are looking into AI or machine learning as part of that community, because we do want to have what we're referring to as a hard science universe, which means everything has to be rooted in our current understanding of physics and time and space and all of that, right? No one's going to be lifting, star destroyers with their brain, essentially, or midichlorians, whatever we settled out with. So we're looking for really everybody in the pool, as I like to call it. And we ask that you simply just apply for the alpha through our website and hope to get that rolled out in the next few months.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of how these submissions are selected to be part of the lore, how is it done? Is it chosen by a central authority, or is it more like voted by the community? And if so, how is the community selected in the first place?
Right. So we're going to need to kind of build out this community through the private alpha. We'll probably do a private and a public beta as well. We are not selecting anything to become part of the canon. There's going to be a whole canonization process that we hope to reveal in the next couple of months as well, along with the alpha. It's unlikely that there will be anything up for canonization in the alpha or the beta, but that's still variable. Still things we're certainly talking about internally. But I think at the end of the day, it'll come down to a community vote, and there'll certainly be a lot of different considerations that factor in there. Very few, if any, of which will be dictated by a centralized party such as ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And moving more away from the tech side and more on the business side, can you talk generally about how copyright is being attributed? Because on your white paper, one of my favorite parts there is that you mentioned that it's quite absurd for the Greek government to receive royalties every time a Greek myth is being told. So yeah, can you speak generally about how you guys think about copyright?
Sure. I mean, I think it goes back to what we were saying just a few moments ago. There's still some legal considerations we need to work through before we could discuss too much. But I think it's simply that, folks should be getting credit for what they've done. I mean, we've heard no end of the story, working with all the creators that we do work with, we've heard no end of these kind of horror stories, right? Who got ripped off, who took someone's work and took credit for it, who was part of these usurious business practices. And it breaks your heart, candidly, when you hear kind of these people who are so passionate about their work and are so good at what they do, essentially get conned out of what they're entitled to. So we just want to make sure that, again, that the main goal for us to make sure at the end of the day that the people who are creating the content get attribution for that content. And again, this is another one of the items that we're focusing pretty significantly on as we build out our licensing over time, but there'll be more to come on that front as well in the next few months.
And I'm not sure how much detail you can go into this, but just generally, in terms of ways to make this a sustainable venture and monetize this project, are there ideas being thrown around right now, or is the focus mostly just on scaling this universe up in the first place?
So again, I'll need to stay a little bit high level here as we make some determinations internally, but we're really assessing everything, right? Everything from the more standard, and I would dare to call them legacy revenue models to things that are only really feasible with a blockchain-based decentralized community. What I'll also add is we're not going to just rush into some unnecessary ICO. So tokens will probably be off the table for a bit, but we're just assessing what works best for, again, the creators, right? So one of the considerations around that is we're going to be onboarding a whole new cohort of users to blockchain infrastructure, right? So if we come up with something that's super heavily invested in the Web 3.0 side, but is completely inaccessible to the people who aren't familiar with that infrastructure, who need to use it, that's essentially a failure on our behalf. So what I would point folks to in that capacity is there's another Medium post that we have from Igor Lilich on Medium called Where Does the Blockchain Fit In? I would point folks towards that, essentially talking about how we want to at least start off with a Web 2.5 experience, such that we could bring these creators in and get them familiar with it, get them familiar with cryptocurrency, so that whenever we are, talking about and releasing this kind of revenue model, they're a bit more familiar with the technology and are able to use it.
And just to close this out, I know you talked a little a little bit about what your goal for yourself is in this project, which is for you to not be a central point of failure, or for you to basically, in your own words, not matter in this project.
Exactly.
But for the entirety of Cellarius, what do you see as the overarching goal for the entire project?
I think when I think about it, I think I want the story to keep continuing. What we've done with this first cut of content, this universe guide, we call it the Era 1, or the Genesis era. It encompasses 150 years of time. So starting with the first block of Bitcoin being mined in 2009, going up to 2160. And we asked that, just to keep some guardrails in place, the content that's created in this first wave fits into that timeline. But over time, that story will expand itself in time, right? Maybe it's another 150-year period or another 300-year period, or the time can expand, as community kind of dictates it should. But what I would like to see, I think the rest of the team would want to see, is how the story will evolve based on the former contributions and canonization of content, right? So the next story block of 150 years, whoever creates the universe guide for that, it should be based on the content that's created in this current instance of Cellarius. And then that will kind of become its own virtuous cycle. And that's more for the story side. Another kind of long-term vision is that this will become a platform where creators can come and might be able to even make their living off of it. You see things like all these great portfolios on DeviantArt or ArtStation or Behance. And a lot of that content is created and hosted there such that someone who's hiring for a game development studio or some other project will see that art, reach out to the creator and offer them a job. But we want that creation to be the job in and of itself. So that's certainly another goal for us.
That sounds super exciting, and I'm incredibly excited to see where Cellarius goes from this point onwards. It sounds like it's going to be an exciting story.
Well, thank you. Just give us a few months, and hopefully we'll have some stuff out there.
And that wraps up another episode of the BlockCrunch podcast. If you're interested in learning more about these interesting and exciting new use cases for blockchain out there and the amazing people behind the most promising projects in the space, then definitely subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening on to get notifications for our weekly episodes. You can also give us a 5-star rating to help us get this out to as many people as possible. If you haven't already, please also follow me on Twitter at Mr. Jason Choi. That's MrJasonChoi, because I do share our new episodes there, as well as some transcription for our latest episodes. So with that being said, I look forward to sharing more with you next week, and this has been the BlockCrunch podcast.